The sound was unlike anything the American soldiers had ever encountered. It wasn't the sharp report of rifles or the dull thud of mortars, but something far more unnerving. A mechanical whirring that seemed to rip through the very air, unleashing projectiles at a rate of 200 rounds each minute. The men huddled in their defensive positions dubbed it Hitler's buzz saw. By 1942, it had become the most dreaded noise on any battlefield where American troops faced German adversaries. Yet, across the ocean, within manufacturing plants stretching from Connecticut to Michigan, another formidable weapon was emerging from assembly lines. Heavier, less swift, but possessing a destructive force capable of halting a vehicle in its tracks. This was the M2 Browning .50 caliber machine gun, affectionately referred to by American servicemen as Ma Deuce. And when engineers joined four of these powerful arms together, they forged an instrument that the Germans would come to fear even more than their own deafening buzz saw. They christened it the meat chopper. The genesis of these two instruments of war is rooted in a fundamental truth that military leaders learned at great cost during the Great War. Overwhelming firepower dictates victory. A sheer volume of fire could immobilize entire platoons, disrupt enemy assaults, and alter the course of conflict more decisively than any other single element. By 1939, as ominous clouds once again gathered over Europe, both sides grasped that the impending conflict would hinge on which side could deliver the most devastating sustained automatic fire. In Germany, ordnance designers at Mauser had been wrestling with a particular challenge. Their MG44 machine gun was an exceptional piece of engineering, arguably the finest automatic weapon globally, but its production was costly and time-consuming. As the Wehrmacht prepared for substantial expansion, they required a weapon that could be manufactured with greater speed, at a lower expense, and in significantly larger quantities. The solution arrived in 1941 with the debut of the MG42. The MG42 represented a revolution in its manufacturing simplicity. Constructed predominantly from stamped metal components rather than expensive machine parts, it could be produced in a fraction of the time needed for its predecessor. More critically, it fired at a velocity unmatched by anything else in existence. While the MG34 cycled at 900 rounds per minute, the new weapon could maintain a rate of 1,200 rounds per minute, with some variations reaching 1,500. The sound it produced was distinctive and terrifying. Individual shots merged into a continuous roar that American soldiers likened to the tearing of fabric, or the rapid opening of a colossal zipper at an unbelievable pace. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. When that cacophony erupted from German positions, Allied troops understood they were confronting something far beyond conventional automatic fire. The projectiles arrived so rapidly that seeking shelter became a desperate struggle for survival. Veterans who encountered the MG42 in Tunisia, Sicily, and later in Normandy all recounted the same paralyzing dread upon hearing that mechanical shriek. However, the Germans had inadvertently provided their adversaries with a crucial advantage. The MG42's astonishing rate of fire, while psychologically devastating, created significant logistical complications. At 1,200 rounds per minute, a single weapon could deplete its ammunition supply in mere seconds of continuous firing. Gun crews had to transport immense quantities of ammunition, and resupply became a constant ordeal. More critically, the elevated firing rate generated immense heat, necessitating frequent barrel replacements to prevent the weapon from overheating and malfunctioning. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American industry was gearing up for war with a contrasting philosophy. Where German engineers prioritized velocity and psychological impact, American designers emphasized dependability, power, and sustained firing capability. The M2 Browning, conceived by the renowned John Moses Browning near the conclusion of World War I, perfectly embodied this approach. The M2 fired the massive .50 caliber BMG cartridge, a round nearly double the diameter of the German 7.92 millimeter ammunition. While the MG42 could fire more rapidly, each M2 projectile carried devastating kinetic energy. A single .50 caliber round could penetrate light armor, disable aircraft engines, and inflict casualties at ranges where rifle fire was ineffective. The weapon's 550 rounds per minute rate of fire seemed modest in comparison to the German buzzsaw, but it was steady, sustainable, and remarkably accurate. What truly distinguished the M2 was its adaptability. German forces primarily employed the MG42 as an infantry support weapon, although it could be mounted on vehicles and utilized in defensive emplacements. The American 50 caliber weapon, however, found its way onto virtually every platform the United States military could devise. Sherman tanks carried them for close-range defense. B-17. Flying fortresses bristled with them for protection against fighter assaults. Navy PT boats mounted them for engagements with surface vessels. From the frigid Aleutian Islands to the sweltering jungles of New Guinea, the M2 proved its capability to operate in any environment. But it was when American engineers began experimenting with multiple gun mounts that the true potential of the 50 caliber system became evident. If one M2 was formidable, what could four accomplish working in concert? The answer arrived in 1943 with the introduction of the M45 quad mount, a system that would earn one of the most dreaded monikers of the entire war. The meat chopper, as troops immediately christened the Quad 50 setup, featured four M2 Browning machine guns mounted on a single electrically operated turret. The combined firepower was staggering. While each individual gun fired at 550 rounds per minute, the four-gun system unleashed 2,200 rounds per minute of 50 caliber devastation. Suddenly, American forces possessed a weapons system that not only matched but surpassed the psychological impact of the German MG42. The initial M45 quad mounts appeared in the European theater in early 1944. They were mounted on M16 half-tracks and towed M55 trailers. German pilots, already struggling against increasing Allied air superiority, found themselves facing a new terror. The Quad 50 could engage aircraft at ranges and with firepower that rendered low-altitude attacks suicidal. Luftwaffe pilots, accustomed to strafing Allied positions with relative impunity, discovered that the Americans now possessed the ability to retaliate with equal ferocity. But the true revelation came when Allied forces began employing the meat chopper against ground targets. The concentrated firepower of 450 caliber machine guns could literally pulverize defensive positions. Concrete bunkers crumbled under the sustained barrage. Trees sheltering snipers were felled at their bases. Even lightly armored vehicles found themselves vulnerable to the armor-piercing rounds that the M2 could discharge. The psychological balance had shifted. Where once the sound of the MG42 had sent Allied troops diving for cover, now German soldiers learned to fear the deeper, more sustained roar of the Quad 50. Veterans of the Battle of the Bulge reported that German units would often abandon their positions rather than face the concentrated onslaught of the meat chopper. The weapon had become a force multiplier, impacting morale as much as battlefield capability. Technical specifications only told part of the story. The MG42, for all its fearsome reputation, was fundamentally constrained by its design philosophy. The emphasis on maximum rate of fire created a weapon that was spectacular in short bursts but difficult to sustain in prolonged engagements. Barrel overheating, ammunition consumption, and the strain on gun crews all conspired to limit its effectiveness in extended firefights. The M2, in contrast, was designed for endurance. Its heavy barrel and robust construction allowed for sustained firing that could continue for hours with adequate ammunition. Supply and occasional barrel changes. The 50 caliber cartridge, while requiring a heavier weapon, delivered considerably more energy per shot than the German round. Where the MG42 relied on sheer volume of fire, the M2 achieved its effects through quality and consistency. As American forces commenced their advance into Germany in 1945, they carried with them a comprehensive array of 50 caliber weapons that had proven their worth across every theater of the war. Single M2s provided reliable fire support for infantry units. Vehicle-mounted variants endowed tanks and armored vehicles with unprecedented defensive capabilities. The Quad 50 meat chopper had established American forces as masters of anti-aircraft defense, while simultaneously proving devastating against ground targets. German troops, many of whom had grown up believing in the superiority of their weapons technology, found themselves outmatched by American firepower that seemed inexhaustible. The psychological impact was profound. Where the MG42 had once granted German infantry a decisive edge in defensive actions, Allied forces now possessed the instruments to negate that advantage and overwhelm defensive positions with sustained, accurate fire. The contrast became even more stark when considering production and logistics. While German industry struggled to maintain quality and quantity in weapons production under relentless Allied bombing, American factories were reaching their peak. The M2 Browning was relatively straightforward to manufacture, utilized readily available materials, and could be produced in immense quantities. By the war's conclusion, American industry had delivered over 3 million 50-caliber machine guns to Allied forces worldwide. Perhaps most telling was the reaction of German soldiers who encountered American 50-caliber fire for the first time. Prisoner interrogations revealed that many Wehrmacht veterans, accustomed to the tactical advantages afforded by their own superior automatic weapons, were astonished by the power and sustainability of Allied 50-caliber fire. Reports from the Italian campaign describe German units withdrawing from positions not because they were overrun, but because they could not endure the sustained pounding of M2 fire. The irony was not lost on military observers. Germany had entered the war with what many considered the finest automatic weapons in the world. The MG34 and later the MG42 had provided German infantry with a significant advantage in the early years of the conflict. But by prioritizing rate of fire above all other considerations, German designers had created weapons that, while psychologically intimidating, were ultimately limited in their tactical applications. American weapons designers, working with different priorities and backed by the immense productive capacity of American industry, had forged a family of weapons that excelled not in spectacular displays of firepower, but in the grinding, sustained combat that ultimately determined the outcome of battles. The M2 Browning might not have sounded as terrifying as Hitler's buzzsaw, but when Allied forces needed to deliver sustained, accurate, devastating fire, Ma Deuce and her quad-mounted sister, the meat chopper, proved themselves superior to anything the Germans could field. As Allied forces prepared for the final push into the heart of Nazi Germany, they carried with them weapons that had not only matched but exceeded the psychological and tactical impact of the enemy's most feared automatic weapons. The tables had turned, and the hunters had become the hunted. The morning mist hung low over the Normandy hedgerows as Staff Sergeant Robert Chen adjusted the elevation on his Quad 50 mount. It was June 15, 1944, 9 days after D-Day, and the Americans were pushing inland against fierce German resistance. Chen had been a machine gunner since North Africa, but this was his first time behind the meat chopper, and he was about to discover just how dramatically the balance of automatic firepower had shifted. The German counterattack came at dawn, spearheaded by a company of Wehrmacht infantry, supported by 2 MG42 teams positioned in the bocage. The familiar sound erupted across the battlefield. That terrifying buzz-saw roar that had dominated so many earlier engagements. For a moment, the advancing Americans hesitated, diving for whatever cover they could find, as 1,200 rounds per minute tore through the morning air. But this time was different. Chen depressed his firing button, and the Quad 50 responded with a sound that seemed to shake the earth itself. 4 heavy machine guns speaking in unison, their deep-throated roar drowning out even the MG42s. 2,200 rounds per minute of 50-caliber ammunition transformed the German position into a maelstrom of destruction. The thick Norman hedgerows that had provided such excellent cover for defending forces offered no protection against the armor-piercing rounds that punched through vegetation, stone, and earth with equal ease. Within 90 seconds, both German machine gun positions had fallen silent. The psychological impact on the surviving Wehrmacht soldiers was immediate and profound. For 3 years, they had relied on the superiority of their automatic weapons to offset Allied numerical advantages. Now they faced firepower that not only matched but exceeded their own, delivered with the kind of sustained accuracy that American industrial precision had made possible. This scene played out thousands of times across the European theater, as Allied forces pushed deeper into German-held territory. The tactical revolution represented by weapons like the M45 quad mount was reshaping battlefield dynamics in ways that German military doctrine had never anticipated. Where German tactics emphasized the devastating initial impact of concentrated automatic fire, American firepower doctrine focused on sustained suppression and systematic destruction of enemy positions. The difference became most apparent in urban combat, where the war's final phase would be decided. In cities like Aachen, Cologne, and ultimately Berlin itself, German defenders found their traditional advantages nullified by American heavy weapons that could punch through walls, collapse buildings, and maintain fire for hours without the ammunition and overheating problems that plagued the MG42. Technical Sergeant Maria Vasquez, a 50 caliber gunner with the 1st Infantry Division, described the difference in a letter home to her family in Texas. "The German guns sound scary as all get out, like some kind of machine from hell. But they can't keep it up. We can. When we get into a firefight with those buzzsaws, we just settle in and let Ma Deuce do the talking. Pretty soon, they either run out of ammo or their barrels overheat. And then it's our turn to show them what American firepower looks like." Vasquez was describing a fundamental shift in the nature of automatic weapons combat. The MG42, for all its fearsome reputation, was ultimately a weapon designed for shock effect. Its incredible rate of fire could devastate attacking forces and break up assaults through sheer psychological intimidation. But in the grinding attritional warfare that characterized the final year of the European conflict, sustainability mattered more than spectacle. The M2 Browning family of weapons, from single-mounted versions to the Quad 50 meat chopper, excelled in exactly these conditions. Their heavy barrels could sustain firing for hours. The powerful 50 caliber cartridge retained its effectiveness at ranges where lighter weapons became marginal. Most importantly, American logistical systems could keep these weapons supplied with ammunition and replacement parts under conditions where German supply lines were increasingly disrupted. Nowhere was this advantage more apparent than in the anti-aircraft role, where the meat chopper had originally been intended to serve. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, but German aircraft still posed a threat during the hours of darkness and in hit-and-run attacks on Allied positions. The Quad 50 proved devastatingly effective against these targets, with a reach and destructive power that made low-altitude flight suicidal for German pilots. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm Hoffmann, a Luftwaffe pilot captured after his Focke-Wulf 190 was brought down by Quad 50 fire during the Battle of the Bulge, described the experience in post-war interviews. "We had learned to deal with light anti-aircraft fire. Even the American 30 caliber machine guns, you could fly through that and accept some damage. But those 4-gun 50 caliber mounts, they were different. You could not survive contact with them. The concentration of fire was so intense and the rounds so powerful that any hit was likely to be fatal to the aircraft." Hoffman's testimony revealed another crucial advantage of the American approach to automatic weapons. While optimized for specific roles, the Americans had developed systems that excelled across multiple applications. The same M2 Browning that served as infantry support could be mounted on tanks for close defense, installed in aircraft for offensive firepower, or combined into quad mounts for anti-aircraft work. This versatility simplified logistics, training, and maintenance while providing commanders with flexible tools that could adapt to changing battlefield conditions. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 provided perhaps the most dramatic demonstration of how the balance of automatic firepower had shifted. German forces, launching their last major offensive of the war, initially achieved tactical surprise and local superiority through concentrated attacks spearheaded by their traditional infantry tactics built around MG42 strongpoints. But as American forces recovered from the initial shock and began to organize their defense, the sustainability advantages of their weapon systems became apparent. Sergeant First Class Thomas Rodriguez, manning a Quad 50 position near Bastogne, described the pivotal moment when German advances ground to a halt. "They came at us with everything they had, those buzzsaws chattering like angry hornets. But we had been preparing for this. When they got within range, we opened up with everything we had. The Quad 50s, the single 50s on the tanks, even the aircraft guns when the P-47s could get through the weather. After about an hour of that kind of fire, they stopped coming." Rodriguez was describing the culmination of 3 years of weapons development and tactical evolution. The Americans had not simply matched German firepower, they had exceeded it in the areas that mattered most for sustained combat operations. Reliability, ammunition capacity, thermal management, and logistical support had all been prioritized over the spectacular but ultimately limited advantages of maximum rate of fire. The human cost of this technological shift was profound for German forces. Veterans of the Wehrmacht who survived the war consistently reported that American 50 caliber fire had a psychological impact that even exceeded the feared MG42. Where their own weapons created brief but intense periods of devastating fire, the American heavy machine guns seemed to offer no respite. The continuous pounding impact of 50 caliber rounds could break down the strongest defensive positions and shatter the morale of even veteran troops. Private Johann Weber, captured during the final weeks of the war, told his interrogators about the effect of sustained 50 caliber fire on German defensive positions. Our machine guns could stop attacks, yes, but only for a time. When the Americans brought up their heavy weapons, it was different. They could fire all day, it seemed, and there was no protection. The sound alone would make men crack after hours of bombardment. And unlike our guns, they never seemed to run out of ammunition. Weber's testimony highlighted another crucial factor in the eventual German defeat. While the MG42 required extensive training to operate effectively, particularly in managing ammunition, consumption, and barrel changes, the American M2 systems were designed for ease of operation. This allowed American forces to deploy effective automatic firepower more broadly across their units, rather than concentrating it in specialized machine gun teams, as German doctrine required. The industrial facet of this arms race highlighted profound divergences in how each side approached military engagements. German engineering prowess had birthed the MG42, a precision instrument of combat meticulously crafted for peak efficacy, yet demanding proficient operators and diligent upkeep. In contrast, America's industrial ethos yielded the M2 series, embodying robust, dependable implements, capable of being wielded effectively by soldiers lacking extensive specialized training, all while ensuring unwavering performance in challenging circumstances. By the opening months of 1945, as Allied armies advanced into Germany itself, the psychological toll of American superiority and firepower began to erode German resolve at every echelon. Contemporary intelligence accounts detail German units vacating their positions at the mere intimation of Quad 50 fire, with Wehrmacht commanders imploring tactical retreats rather than attempting to hold territory against relentless barrages from American heavy armaments. The ultimate paradox lay in German forces actively seeking to capture and deploy American 50 caliber weaponry whenever the opportunity arose. Reports from the war's final stages chronicle German troops utilizing captured M2, Brownings, and even endeavoring to reverse engineer the Quad 50 platforms. The very weapons once dismissed by some German officers as unsophisticated American products had demonstrated their supremacy in the protracted engagements that defined the conflict's denouement. When the guns finally ceased their thunder in May 1945, a statistical comparison between the two weapon systems revealed a narrative extending far beyond mere technical specifications. The MG42, notwithstanding its formidable reputation and undeniable battlefield effectiveness, had been manufactured in approximately 400,000 units. The M2 Browning family, conversely, had achieved production figures surpassing 3 million arms by the war's conclusion. More critically, American 50 caliber weapons remained in active service across numerous nations for many decades following the cessation of hostilities. The foundational M2 design, with only minimal alterations, continued to serve as the primary heavy machine gun for NATO forces and persisted in production well into the 21st century. The MG42, despite its ingenious technical advancements, was largely relegated to obsolescence by post-war German forces, who favored armaments prioritizing dependability and sustainability over an exceedingly high rate of fire. The enduring impact of this competition in arms extended well beyond the immediate tactical advantages it conferred. The American methodology in automatic weapons design, emphasizing adaptability, steadfastness, and sustained firing capacity, became the benchmark for subsequent machine gun development globally. The MG42's influence, while significant in specific technological innovations such as quick-change barrels and efficient manufacturing processes, was ultimately eclipsed by the more fundamental strengths exhibited by the American arsenal. Veterans from both sides who survived the conflict and had the opportunity to recount their experiences uniformly arrived at analogous conclusions. The MG42 was undeniably a more dramatic weapon, delivering an immediate and devastating psychological blow. However, the M2 Browning, in its myriad configurations from single mounts to the Quad 50 meat chopper, proved more efficacious in the grueling war of attrition that ultimately determined the war's outcome. Perhaps the most insightful appraisal emanated from General Omar Bradley, who oversaw American forces throughout the European campaign. In his post-war memoirs, Bradley articulated, "The German machine gun was undeniably fearsome in its sound and initial impact. Yet, when we required the clearing of a fortified position, the provision of continuous fire support for our advancing troops, or the denial of airspace to enemy aircraft, there was no substitute for American .50 caliber firepower. It secured victories not through dread, but through unflagging, dependable performance when our soldiers needed it most." Bradley's evaluation perfectly encapsulated the fundamental distinction between the two schools of thought in automatic weapon design. The MG42 represented the zenith of arms engineered for psychological effect and tactical shock. The M2 family embodied a distinct philosophy, one that championed the unglamorous yet indispensable attributes of reliability, endurance, and versatile application, which ultimately proved more decisive in shaping the war's resolution. As the final salvos of the Second World War reverberated across Europe, it became evident that the Americans had not merely outgunned their German adversaries, they had outmaneuvered them by developing weapon systems better aligned with the realities of modern industrial warfare. The meat chopper and its single-mount counterparts had demonstrated that, in the final analysis, the most formidable weapon was not necessarily the one that produced the most terrifying sound, but rather the one that continued to discharge its payload when all other systems had fallen silent. The buzzsaw had been stilled, not by a louder roar, but by a more enduring power.